The Hate You Give is the debut novel by debut novelist Angie Thomas. Hang on a minute, that's completely redundant. Let me try again. The Hate You Give is the first novel by Angie Thomas, who is a novelist. This book focuses on the life of our main character Starr following the shooting of her best friend Khalil by a police officer. What follows is a tale about finding your identity using your voice in a system that's actually rigged quite harshly to make sure that that voice is silenced and never used for anything. So let's talk about the good things with this book. This book has been getting a lot of praise, and I think, to be honest, it's justified. The book's very good. Let's just get that out of the way right at the start. There's a lot of good things to say about it. I've got some negative things to say as well. It's a little bit more of a balanced review, but let's get the good things out of the way first. The best thing I think about this book is the characters that are portrayed. I think Angie Thomas, for a first-time writer, has done a fantastic job of bringing characters to life, especially Starr. I think she's like a absolutely fantastic protagonist. Her voice is very strong. All of the characters' voices are very strong. Like you read the characters and they're very distinguished. That's not something you get a lot with books. A lot of books that I read, sometimes the characters aren't as strong as I would like. And what I mean by that is not, oh, they don't stab enough people with fucking swords. They're not strong. They can't lift up trucks with their feet or whatever. No, that's what I mean. I mean, they're not strong in terms of a standout voice and personality. That's something that I think is lacking a lot of the time. Characters tend to blend together to form a narrative. That happens a lot with plot-based books, which is something that I'm not such a big fan of. But with this book, a very different story. Starr is, like I say, a very standout character. She's got many different facets to her personality, and sort of one of the great things the book does is showing how she bounces between those different sides of her personality to fit in with different social groups, which is something she does seemingly unconsciously, although there's sort of a internal monologue suggesting that she needs to sort of act it a bit in order to blend in with different people. One of the other characters I think that needs to be talked about is, I'm not going to spoil who it is because I don't want to put spoilers in the book, but there's a character in here which I think is the first example I've seen of really well done ignorance for a character. You see a lot of characters that are outwardly hostile. They've got backwards views and things like that, but they're not unintentional. There's always like a malice behind those characters. Like you can talk a lot about. I'll use an example that pretty much everyone on BookTube will know about. Like, you know, you've got your Draco Malfoy, and he comes along, and immediately he's like this snotty little piece of shit, and like he's got his blonde hair and his fucking Nazi symbolism, and he's like, oh, I don't like you, Potter, because you're fucking poor. And then later on he's like, I don't like you, Hermione, because J.K. Rowling's decided to put racism in the book. It's ridiculous. Like, Draco Malfoy is a ridiculous villain, okay? He's just silly. So he's silly. He's for children. This book has a character that is a racist. Like, it's like this character is a racist, and they don't realise that they're a racist. And that's brilliant. Like, that's a great thing. Like, it highlights this ignorance. Like, you're reading this book, like, as a white person, I'm reading this book, and I'm like, dude, you need to sort this shit out. You can't be saying and doing these things. But that's great. I think that's brilliant. Like, that's a character that I would never have thought that I would find in this book. So that's amazing. Characters are great. In terms of the writing style, I think sometimes it does struggle to come above merely perfunctory. Like the actual writing, like it's not going to be winning any awards for like fucking most flowery sentence in the world awards. Like, but it doesn't need that, I think, because the way that the story is constructed is not so much about the plot. It's not so much about the way that it's written, but it's more about the characters and the dynamics between them. I think one of the strongest dynamics in the book is with Starr's entire family. I think it's really well portrayed how they get along as a family. She's got two brothers. One of the brothers isn't related to her by And so she's got one full biological brother and a half brother, and then there's like the half brother's sister from another family, and then they're sort of like friends, but they're kind of, I guess they're almost cousins, but not quite. So that's all very interesting, like the way that these like the family works and the way that the community is portrayed, I think is very strong as well. Where the writing, I think, could stand to be shored up is with the plot, and a couple of the characters, but I'm going to go back into that later, because I think there's a few other things that I want to talk about on positives first, because as I say, there's a lot to say good about this book. The other thing, I think a lot of people are saying that the plot is very strong, and I agree in a way. I think that for a first novel, I think what has been attempted here is very ambitious, and what's done is Angie Thomas has taken all these different aspects of life in like deprived areas of America. Like it's never officially stated, but I'm pretty sure this is based off like South Central LA or Chicago maybe, but basically like it's a deprived black area, like it's mostly black residents, and I think what Angie Thomas has done is cherry picked different aspects of like major news headlines throughout the years. Like it's inspired, like quite famously, the author's been very open about it, it's inspired by the whole Black Lives Matter movement, which sort of started in 2013. It's a more recent thing, but I think it definitely takes inspiration from much older issues, especially many parallels to the to like the LA riots and that kind of thing. Like the LA riots is, if you don't know, was a response by South Central LA the black community there, in response to the not guilty verdicts for 4 police officers in the beating of Rodney King, who was at the time of his being pulled over was just driving in his car, but it sort of turns out that he was maybe a little bit of a shit as well, but like it's irrelevant. Like the guy should not have been fucking stomped by 6 cops. It's fucking ridiculous. So the LA riots was like a big tipping point for this whole thing back in the 90s. It's 92. Lots of, I think there's a lot of homages to that sort of thing. She talks a lot about like rap music from that time specifically. Like you've got Tupac, who naturally inspired the title of the book. There's obviously quotes from NWA, like the very famous song "Fuck the Police," very much about standing up for yourself against this sort of thing. And that song was almost released almost fucking 30 years ago. So that just tells you how relevant like that kind of issue is and how little things have changed. But I think it's a really good portrayal, a broad portrayal of those sorts of issues. And now I need to talk about some of the negatives. So if you don't want to hear negative things about books, right, you ready? Because we're going to start criticising a favourite book of a lot of people this year. Let's talk about the things that aren't so good. So my last point that I made in terms of things that are good is that Angie Thomas portrays a very broad portrayal of racial discrimination and issues facing that amongst communities. Now, what I think is a negative is that there wasn't enough exploration of things that were central to the book. What I think happened is, this is Angie Thomas's first book. I think she wanted to make a statement, a strong statement about oppression in black communities. I think she wanted to portray that in the most realistic way possible. And I think she did that by dipping into a lot of different areas. Now, I think that became a problem because we didn't get too much of an opportunity to focus on some of the major ones. So the main plot of the story is Starr's fight against the justice system, basically to get justice for her friend Khalil, who was shot by a police officer. Now, we, in favour of dipping into other subplots, like I think the boarding school subplot, it's not a boarding school, it's like a private school, like an elite school or whatever. So there's a subplot in an elite school that Starr goes to. I think that was very necessary to the story, and I think that was good that that stayed. What I don't think was a necessary storyline was the gang-related violence in the neighbourhood. I think a lot of that could have been cut out. I don't think it was necessary to the overall theme, and I think it was put in there as a forced conflict, and just to have like a guy at the end of the book to be the bad guy. Like there's a guy called King, and he's in a gang called the Kings. It's not, that's like a bit weird, but he's like there, and he's like a 2D like gangster thug kind of guy, which I think as another criticism is actually kind of weird to have like a guy who's like that, who's like, I get that guys like that exist, like he's like a violent thug idiot guy. I get like that guys like that exist, and you can't shy away from that kind of thing, but at the same time I think in a book where you're trying to say, isn't it bad that black communities are often stereotyped this way, to then like have a guy as well that you can point at and go, yeah, look at this prick, like he's a fucking asshole. Like it's just weird. I think it's a bit odd. At first I didn't really think that it was that odd, but then later on I realized, like, what was the point of this guy other than just to be an asshole? Like you didn't need him there to be an asshole. Like the story, like he's a gang member who then got involved with this thing, like just for no reason, I guess. Like it didn't need to be there. So that all of that stuff distracts from scenes I think that we wanted to have in the book. Like it's not a short book for YA, especially like it's 435 pages. It's a 435 page book. The font, as you can see, is like it's like because it's a YA book, like you expect the margins to be wide like this and the lines to be spaced out. But the thing is, you didn't get to probe in depth to the moral greyness of the situation, especially with like there's a particular scene where Starr goes to, there's like a pivotal scene in the book, and it cuts off right at the moment you want to know more. Like, what's the evidence to the contrary? Like, we've got Starr's point of view. We know Khalil's not like a complete prick. He wasn't like, we know this cop's guilty, basically. We know that the cop's guilty, but there's no portrayal of why he was, other than the fact that he was white. I think it was kind of like, it took the message and it boiled it down to its core message, which was that there's a lot of bias towards the police, but I think it ignored a lot of the more complicated moral issues surrounding it in favour of a more black and white portrayal, pardon the pun, but it was a more moral absolutist point of view of the whole thing, rather than I think what would have happened if this was not aimed at teenagers. I think there would have been more of an effort to explore the morals and politics of both sides, rather than just boiling it down to, this happens to us, these guys are the bad guys. I think that's the sort of story that it was going for, and I think it made its points well. But I think it could have done better with a little bit more explanation and a little bit more depth. I especially, one of the things that I found kind of annoying, as well as like this King guy who's just being like utterly reprehensible, like I think a lot of the people that we are meant to think are bad were just bad. Like they didn't get to be good as well. Like the cop, for example, like we know he was in the wrong, like he's a piece of shit, but he's sort of portrayed as a piece of shit even more, because like he starts lying about things rather than just sort of being quiet. Like he makes he gets his dad to make public appearances for him where he lies about it, and it's like, it's fucking weird. Like this guy's obviously just a piece of shit, and then you've got, on the other hand, like the characters that we are supposed to root for, like, are always good guys. and are always seemingly justified in the things they do. Like there's a character called Devonte, and like he's a gangbanger guy, but then it turns out like he's like a good gangbanger who isn't just a drug dealer, I guess. And like Khalil, we learn some things about Khalil that are a bit shady, but then like he does them for a good reason, so I guess it's okay. And like I think there's a thing where it should be morally grey, and we should question whether or not to root for the character, but then we're sort of told that it doesn't matter if he's morally shady, he's one of the good guys. And I think that's kind of simplifying everything. And I think that's probably one of the problems that comes from this being a YA novel. I think it's one of the reasons I don't usually reach for YA novels, is this oversimplification of important issues. But let's talk about that more in the conclusions, because I'm going to need to wrap this up now. Right, let's wrap this up by reiterating a few important points. This book is really, really good. Let me stress that now, because I know we got a little bit negative there towards the end. Now, I think this book is very important to be read by a YA audience. I think it's got a lot of value for a YA audience. Now let me tell you why, because I know I just sort of went on a whole thing about how this book was hurt a little bit by being YA, but obviously that's just from my perspective as a more adult reader, because I'm a fucking grown man. Now, for a YA audience, I think this is really important, and here's why. It's because of the message. Now, you don't hear a lot of this sort of message for a YA audience. The typical YA story, especially YA contemporaries, are all about if Boo will follow you back on Instagram or whatever the fuck they're about. And this book tries at least to really delve into important topics. I think it does a really good job with a realistic portrayal of a lot of the characters. As I say, some of the characters a little bit cartoonish, a little bit simplified, but I think it does a really good job of presenting these issues, if not analysing them in depth and really getting into the heart of them with the more controversial debates. I think it's a really good entry point into thinking about this kind of thing, and it would be very, very good if we could have more of this sort of thing taught in schools. Unfortunately, it will never be taught in schools because it says fuck and the N-word like a lot in it. So that's a shame. But you should probably read this if you're a grown-up that reads YA. You should probably read this if you're a teenager that reads YA. You should probably just read this in general if you don't know a whole lot about the civil rights thing and the whole Black Lives Matter thing. And maybe if you're sitting there asking questions like, why is this important? Why is this an important issue? Read this book, because that will tell you why it's an important issue, you socially unaware dummy. Final thing I'm going to do before begging you for subscriptions is giving a movie recommendation. Now, this is something I want to do a little bit more of on this channel, because it's called Plots and Points, not Books and Points. We can talk about things that are have plots in them that aren't books, right? Of course we can. So what I'm going to do for future reviews, if I think it's appropriate, I won't do it all the time, I'm going to try and recommend a film that you can watch after you've read a book to complement it, you know, get a little bit more of that same sort of feeling. Now today I'm going to be recommending this. It's called Boys in the Hood. That's how it's pronounced, right? It's Boys in the Hood with a Z. It's a film from 1991, I want to say, yeah, 1991. Stars Ice Cube, Cuba Gooding Jr., and Lawrence Fishburne, back when he was humble enough to go by the name Larry. It's all about young men being raised in a south central Los Angeles area during the 90s, and it is a lot about their lives and their experiences dealing with violence and deprivation in a similar way that the Hate You Give is. And I think it's an absolutely fantastic film, very hard hitting. It's a 15, so if you're 15 you can watch it, I guess. So go ahead and watch it. It's very uncompromising, very provocative and in your face, much like The Hate You Give is. So let's hold them up together. Look at these complementary materials. That's pretty much all I have to say. So go ahead and rate this video with a thumbs or whatever the fuck it is you do on YouTube now. Leave a like. Is that the same as rating now? Who knows? Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, because I'm going to be doing more reviews and stuff of that nature in the future. And leave a comment down below with either what you think about The Hate You Give, telling me I'm a fucking moron for raising any sort of criticism against it, or telling me what you think of this film, or if you've seen it. So thanks for watching. I'll see you next time, and that's it. Bye.